landscape of despair before hope and faith and joy can flourish. We must act while we wait, even as we suffer, without self-pity or hatred towards those who oppress us. Perhaps the new standard bearers of this epochal peace will be crucified again, or perhaps the new day will dawn after the fearful figure of Krishna slays the demon king Kamsa in bloody battle. However it turns out to be, there are millions of us who want to be free. We want to see once again the free bird's flight in the clear blue sky. That is why we are waiting for a new sun to rise. While we wait, we must prepare ourselves well by loving life as deeply as only passionate beings like us can. Only then will we be ready to greet our sister sun in full readiness with open hearts. So I wrote that a long time ago, but still it means a lot to me, and I hope I have tried to live my life in accordance with what I so passionately felt and expressed at that time. And the other piece, the New Bodhi, I actually am writing a much longer book on this in Bengali. But here I tried to connect some poets, fragments of whose poems I have translated in the beginning, with things that exist, especially in the so-called esoteric traditions of all spiritual paths that I know of, from Christianity and Judaism to Islam, to Hinduism, to Buddhism, to Taoism, to Shintoism in Japan, etc. Of course, I don't know everything. I don't know as much about Native American spiritual traditions as I would like to. I'm learning all the time. But here, I think, again, this idea of solidarity, of friendship, of love, of communion comes up again and again. And the quote I have from Rumi, the great mystic poet from near Turkey and northern Persia, I think expresses this quite well. As Rumi says so beautifully, "O love, O pure, deep love, be here, be now, be all. Worlds dissolve into your stainless, endless radiance. Frail, living leaves burn with your brighter than coal stares. Make me your servant, your breath, your core." And that's definitely a prayer worth heeding. I think no matter how complicated a poet is, a poet always really has been throughout history, regardless of culture, regardless of the historical origin, by this yearning for love. Of course, it is quite often not fulfilled, and even the non-fulfillment has given rise to a great literature historically in almost every literary tradition that I know of, which of course is not all. If we now trace our way back from Paz through Brecht and Neruda to Elliot, quickly, because we don't have that much time, we can see this. In case of Paz, because he was so frustrated by Spanish Civil War and then also betrayal of revolution by Stalin and his people, he meandered around for a long time. He was really in a dark tunnel, as he describes it in his other writing. And this great poem, Piedra de Sol, is his way trying to connect with history, but from within the context of a Mexican past and Aztec past, but using all the resources of modernism at the same time. And the poem is really wonderful. It begins and ends with the same lines. So it's a kind of circular journey back, but also it's a journey that doesn't come back just to the origin, but really moves forward towards hope, towards light. So it begins, when I wrote this essay, you can find this online, by the way, and it's been anthologized in several places, I'm told. So this may be the best read thing I ever wrote in English. Many of my books and technical articles probably are read only by a few who think they're the cognoscenti, but I hope the literary pieces are more widely shared. So Paz begins Piedra de Sol with these lines: a willow of crystal, a poplar of water, a tall fountain the wind arches over, a deep-rooted tree, but dancing away, a river course that curves, advances, recedes, comes back again, forever arriving. I compared actually my translation with Weinberger's the other day. I did it because I had no other source. And I actually find mine more musical than his is. But then he's not a poet, but he's a very good translator. But the poem is very deceptive too, because it is a meandering through a hall of mirrors, labyrinths, and traps. Paz tells us elsewhere that words are like traps and jails, but they can also be like bridges. So I think any poet who really is not self-indulgent, who is really trying to communicate and has something that is discovering, he or she is discovering in the process of communicating, must feel this way about words, their ambiguities, their ambivalences, their dangers, and their possibilities at the same time. So here we find the body of a woman, several are the same, called Melusina, Eloise, Persephone, Maria, and other names, merges surrealistically with various natural objects, and the stone goddess / nature comes alive at the end. And it's very densely packed with all kinds of images and sound effects. It is really made to perform a magic. It is a magical poem in that sense. But the limits of magic are also there, captured in the descriptions of very brutal and palpable violence. The violence of history has to be acknowledged for Paz and for us in the question, does nothing happen? Only a blink? And the feast, the exile, the primary crime, the jawbone of the ass, the opaque thud, and the incredulous glance of the dead falling on an ash-covered plain, Agamemnon's great bellow, the scream of Cassandra, over and again, louder than the screams of the sea, Socrates in chains. The jackal, discoursing in the ruins of Nineveh, the shade before Brutus on the eve of the battle, Moctezuma, insomniac on his bed of thorns, the carriage riding towards death, the interminable ride counted minute by Robespierre, his broken jaw between his hands, Churruca on his cask-like scarlet throne, the numbered steps of Lincoln as he left for the theater, the death rattle of Trotsky and his howl like a boar. Trotsky, of course, was killed by an assassin in Mexico in Paz's own lifetime. So that is particularly vivid and intense and relevant. But he takes us through a whole lot of traditions, the Bible, the reference to Samson, the reference to Mexican history, as well as the reference to French Revolution, Robespierre, and his death, and many others. So there is violence in history and in reason, but also in imagination. This should harken us back to Eagleton's criticism of imagination in that chapter. This violence is the rational man's other. This is the goddess of stone, the teeth mother, or Kali, drinking blood from human skull. And we know after postmodernism and post-structuralism that there are all kinds of unconscious forces here at play, linguistically. But the fact remains that the darkness of history is deep within us. Suppressing this and trying to create a presence that is merely the appearance of the good life would be self-deception. So what to do? Paz is not going to just settle for something cheap and superficial. He tells us about, for example, this afternoon of saltpeter and stone armed with invisible razors in red, indescribable script. You write on my skin and the wounds dress me like a suit of flames. And then he goes on to tell us several lines later, I burn endlessly, I search for water, but in your eyes there is no water. So at the end, he can only perform some kind of a transformational magic, which he hopes will come true. The stone becomes alive. Bread again tastes better. In this, of course, love plays a big role. When he describes the bombing of Spain, he also counterposes that, almost like in a film cut and shift to another scene with two young people, a young man and woman making love, and thus defying the brutalities around them. But he knows also that this kind of private and individual gesture cannot solve the tragic riddles of history by themselves, although they are much to be welcome. But we need to do more and hope for more, but he doesn't tell us what. He doesn't give us any easy answers. And I think anybody who is trying to think seriously about human rights, do things in the field of human rights, time and again must confront these kind of riddles, enigmas, questions, puzzles, problems that are truly gut-wrenching and soul-wrenching. So Paz has indeed left us with problems. Brecht was more optimistic because in his time, which was also a time when Paz was young, there was hope that the socialist movement would result in a much better world. Of course, the results have been very mixed, and Stalinism definitely is not something that is to be equated with humane kind of socialism. It was definitely very brutal, even if it industrialized the former Soviet Union, some parts of it anyway, and led to almost complete literacy. And the heroic Soviet people fought against the Nazis and won. All those are great achievements, not just for them, but for humanity as a whole. On the other hand, the brutalities that they suffered and they still suffer are definitely very tragic indeed. And no one can support those things if one cares about human rights. So I see Brecht and people like him as tragic figures, but at the same time, deeply honest people too, especially as artists. So Brecht points out, for example, that working people are always absent from elitist history. And good historians are really trying to correct that thing. Guha's book, by the way, is an example of subaltern history, history from below. And I have written, I hope, a fairly favorable and illuminating review of the book that will make sense to us in this course especially. But he also is honest enough to confront the problems, and that is why he has this poem apologizing to the future generations. And there are some very moving lines there. In one place he says, for example, you from the future, please forgive us because we who wanted people to love one another could not love ourselves. And what a tragic admission that really is when you think about it. And I remember what Emma Goldman, the great American woman anarchist, once said. She said that a revolution which has no place for love is not for me. And I agree. It's not for me either. So I see Brecht as a great tragic figure of the 20th century. Elliot is definitely another tragic figure who, however, chose the quietest option of religious surrender. He became an Anglican Catholic. But when he wrote The Wasteland, he was going through a lot of turmoil and inner doubts that also were connected to his own personal life. He was an American from New England whose family had first migrated to Missouri, but I think kept within a circle that was very much New England-like. And his mother was also a poet, although I don't think she published anything, or maybe only a few things. Elliot was greatly influenced by her. He went to Harvard, studied philosophy. He also studied Indian philosophy and Sanskrit, among other things. Almost finished a Ph.D. at that time, but went to Europe. And he didn't know, not many people knew that First World War will happen at that time. So almost as soon as he had moved to Europe, the war started. And he was a very sensitive and intelligent person, so he could not have noticed what was going on, although he was not a European and he was not involved personally. But many of his friends were. And he also ran into financial trouble and had to work in a bank as a clerk. And he got married to an English woman. And given his earlier puritanical ambivalence about sexuality and other things, plus I think it could be true that his wife was somewhat unstable, Vivian was her name. He was going through a lot of domestic turmoil. He never really talked much about her. And some people who were his close friends only saw his side of the story. But research now, especially a very big volume of biography, which I just finished reading, that came out in the year 2000. It's written by a woman who has also written a very good biography of Nabokov's wife, Vera Nabokov, and her contribution to Nabokov's literary efforts. She writes really good biographies of women. This is I think, the first biography by her that I read, which is of a man. But there, she actually restores to some extent the place of Elliott's wife and her tragedy. It's very sympathetic, I think, in that sense, to the women in Elliott's life. There was another woman from New England, from Boston, I think, with whom Elliot was very close. But he did not marry her. His second wife actually was his secretary, whom he married in 1956. And apparently, that relationship was much more stable, and he was more happy in that relationship. I don't know if one could really call him a happy man, but he was more happy at that phase of his life, during that phase of his life, than any time previously. Anyway, I think Wasteland is a great poem. Ezra Pound said once that these were the best or most important 19 pages written ever in the English language. He was exaggerating, I think, but not much. It's a poem that became widely talked about and written about almost as soon as it appeared. And I think the reason was not just the personal issues that Elliot raises there, but really the global situation, the carnage of the First World War, the destruction of stable values, the misery of the people around him, and sensitive people in Europe, all over Europe, feeling that a world had ended for them. And these were people who were very comfortable before the war, not the poor people, not the proletariat, not the poor peasants who were revolting, of course, all over Europe. So this was a time of great economic, political, social, cultural upheaval in Europe. And sensitive minds who were looking for answers, looking for clues, looking for pathways, found in this poem a great deal that they could identify with. One critic who has written a very perceptive book, actually, a whole book about the wasteland, also points out the poetic accomplishments of Elliot. In its vivid imagery, musical virtuosity, and complexity of form, The Wasteland has been found by most readers to be aesthetically satisfying at a very deep level. Moreover, in its own time, it seemed highly original and technically innovative. While we have become accustomed to such poetic techniques as allusion, ironic juxtaposition, and sudden shifts in imagery and style, Eliot's use of them seemed strikingly new in 1922. They added to a complexity of idea, the complexity of an unfamiliar style. The effect of these techniques has retained its value. Reading the poem carefully, one is rewarded by unexpectedly rich associations. In the opening passage, for example, the summer shower of rain is more poignant for its link to the disturbing rain of April. And the wet hair of the hyacinth girl picks up the memory of spring rain again to associate her anticipation of love with the yearly resurgence of life and growth. Eliot's poetic mastery goes beyond imagery. He has a fine ear for rhythm and musical effect and an ability to produce many moods and tones. He ranges from the lyric beauty of the inexplicable splendor of Ionian white and gold to the jazz rhythm of oh, 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 that Shakespearean rag, to that crude conversational style of Lil's friend. And if you don't give it him, there's others will, I said. Eliot's skill at both metric variation and precise, intense images is maintained in passage after passage. Well, we don't have much time, so without further ado, I will let Elliot recite his own poem to us, and it will be explanatory in that sense, I hope. And from time to time, I may stop it and refer to a few things. But we can listen to the whole poem, and in the next class, if we have time, we might discuss it a little further. Okay, let me see. I wonder, oh yeah, this is the fourth quartet. We have to rewind it, I think. Let me see. Yeah. Okay, while I'm rewinding this, let me point out a few things from the burial of the dead part. That's the beginning part. And I should also mention that several things actually hold the poem together because it is composed of so many different voices. It can be very confusing. One is that there is a central voice, which is the voice of a narrator, and you'll hear it from time to time. There is also a mythical figure, Tiresias, the blind Greek seer. He comes from the Greek mythology and the Greek tragedies. And then we have also the various kinds of classifications. We have the four elements: earth, air, fire, water. And there's a fifth section of the poem which is connected to these elements. So it is carefully crafted. And at the beginning, he tells us that April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. Winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dried tubers. So it's a very unusual way of beginning a poem, which seems like a nature poem, but it really is not. And there, I think Eagleton can be very helpful because there is an evident clash between form and content here. Because in the Western literary tradition, there have been nature poems, at least from Chaucer on. You know, if you read Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, he talks about April showers. And then, of course, almost every major poet and many minor poets even always had some poem or song about the spring and about love, about gaiety, about being alive and joyful, and so on and so forth. But here he's turning everything around. Okay, I think this will work this time. Oh.
Time present and time past are both perhaps present in time.
I think I have been beaten by this machine. Oh, I see. These are mislabeled. No wonder. So we have to rewind it again. Okay, so let me say a few more words then about the effect of this poem in the 1920s. When the poem was first published, it actually appeared in two places before it became a book. And it won a literary prize of $2,000, which was a lot of money then, and certainly a lot of money for Elliot. And with this money, I think he, and help from other friends, he could finally quit his bank job, which I'm sure was killing him. In fact, he had a nervous breakdown from that bank job, and people sent him, giving him financial help to Switzerland to recover. Nice to have such friends, I think, if you're a poet or a musician or an artist. And there he completed this poem, and Pound did considerable editing. But that does not mean that Pound actually in any way can be thought of as a co-author. And Pound never claimed that for himself either. So when it was published, it was very shocking to people for the reasons that we went over. But it also encouraged a number of people, especially poets, to do more experimentation with language. In Paris at that time, there were a group of American writers who were very excited by this. Most of them were prose writers like Hemingway. Some were poets. James Joyce was in Paris at this time. Joyce published his book Ulysses at about the same time, around 1922. Sylvia Beach, who was an expatriate American, was the first publisher of Joyce. And Joyce started working on his Finnegan's Wake, which, by the way, somebody counted had 40 different languages in it, although it's supposed to be an English work in the English language. It may be the most difficult literary work in the English language. I wrote an essay on 2 paragraphs from Finnegan's Wake. Unfortunately, it's in Bengali, and actually about 4 words from those 2 paragraphs. People like Elliot and Joyce and others inspired one another. So the poem was part of you can almost call it a literary and even social movement of the 1920s. How to really get out of the traps of a very destructive turn that European civilization had taken. I think that would be one way to put the question that these people were asking themselves and others broadly. And of course, this was a time of great crisis with depression in Europe already in the 1920s, and then of course in the US, which was supposed to be innocent and out of these troubles in 1930s. Rise of right-wing movements all over the world, but especially in Europe. But even here in America, if you read the history of the 30s, there were fairly strong right-wing fascist movements in this country. So that should also alert us to some of the puzzles and problems of our times, because with globalization, with neoliberalism, we also are facing a similar type of cultural situation. Of course, we have our own specific differences, and those are important differences. But the analogy is frighteningly illuminating, I think. taking a long time. Okay, let me see if you have any observations or comments. Anything? Any questions before we listen to the poem?
I think it's just interesting to see how sort of ideas from different, whether it's poetry or music or film, sort of pull together to inform understanding.
It is there. You have to do some work, of course, to bring them together. You must have some intelligent questions, and you have to do some hard work looking at the specific details and connecting them. But that kind of work, I think, is very invigorating. At least that's the way I work. I think otherwise I'd be too bored too. But this is one way to keep your mental life interesting. Okay, I think we can hear Elliot reciting The Wasteland now.
April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. Winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dried tubers. Summer surprised us, coming over the Starnberger See with a shower of rain. We stopped in the colonnade and went on in sunlight into the Hofgarten and drank coffee and talked for an hour. Bin gar keine Russin, stamm aus Litauen, echt Deutsch. And when we were children, staying at the Archduke's, my cousin's, he took me out on a sled, and I was frightened. He said, Marie, Marie, hold on tight, and down we went. In the mountains there you feel free. I read much of the night and go south in the winter. What are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish? Son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images where the sun beats and the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief, and the dry stone no sound of water. Only there is shadow under this red rock. Come in under the shadow of this red rock, and I will show you something different from either your shadow at morning striding behind you, or your shadow at evening rising to meet you. I will show you fear in a handful of dust. Frisch weht der Wind der Heimat zu. Mein irisch Kind, wo weilest du? You gave me hyacinths first a year ago. They called me the hyacinth girl. Yet when we came back late from the hyacinth garden, your arms full and your hair wet, I could not speak and my eyes failed. I was neither living nor dead, and I knew nothing, looking into the heart of light, the silence. Hört und leer das Meer. Madame Sosostris, famous clairvoyant, had a bad cold. Nevertheless, is known to be the wisest woman in Europe, with a wicked pack of cards. Here, said she, is your card, the drowned Phoenician sailor. Those are pearls that were his eyes. Look. Here is Belladonna, the lady of the rocks, the lady of situations. Here is the man with 3 staves, and here the wheel. And here is the one-eyed merchant, and this card, which is blank, is something he carries on his back, which I am forbidden to see. I do not find the hanged man, fear death by water. I see crowds of people walking round in a ring. Thank you. If you see dear Mrs. Equitone, tell her I bring the horoscope myself. One must be so careful these days. Unreal city. Under the brown fog of a winter dawn, a crowd flowed over London Bridge, so many I had not thought death had undone so many. Sighs, short and infrequent, were exhaled, and each man fixed his eyes before his feet, flowed up the hill and down King William Street to where St. Mary Woolnoth kept the hours with a dead sound on the final stroke of 9. There I saw one I knew, and stopped him, crying, "Stetson, you who were with me in the ships at Miley, that corpse you planted last year in your garden, has it begun to sprout? Will it bloom this year, or has the sudden frost disturbed its bed? Oh, keep the dog far hence, that's friend to men, or with his nails he'll dig it up again. You, hypocrite lecteur, mon semblable, mon frère." The chair she sat in, like a burnished throne, glowed on the marble, where the glass, held up by standards wrought with fruited vines, from which a golden Cupidon peeped out, another hid his eyes behind his wing. Double the flames of 7-branched candelabra, reflecting light upon the table as the glitter of her jewels rose to meet it, from satin cases poured in rich profusion. In vials of ivory and coloured glass, unstoppered, lurked her strange synthetic perfumes, unguent, powdered or liquid, troubled, confused, and drowned the sense in odours. Stirred by the air that freshened from the window, these ascended in fattening the prolonged candle flames, flung their smoke into the laquiarea, stirring the pattern on the coffered ceiling. Huge seawood fed with copper burned green and orange, framed by the coloured stone, in which sad light a carved dolphin swam. Above the antique mantle was displayed, as though a window gave upon the sylvan scene, the change of Philomel by the barbarous king so rudely forced. Yet there the nightingale filled all the desert with inviolable voice, and still she cried, and still the world pursues, "Jug, jug," to dirty ears. And other withered stumps of time were told upon the walls. Staring forms leaned out, leaning, hushing the room enclosed. Footsteps shuffled on the stair. Under the firelight, under the brush, her hair spread out in fiery points, glowed into words, then would be savagely still. My nerves are bad tonight. Yes, bad. Stay with me. Speak to me. Why do you never speak? Speak. What are you thinking of? What thinking? What? I never know what you're thinking. Think. I think we're in Rat's Alley, where the dead men lost their bones. What is that noise? The wind under the door. What is that noise now? What is the wind doing? Nothing again, nothing. Do you know nothing? Do you see nothing? Do you remember nothing? I remember those are pearls that were his eyes. Are you alive or not? Is there nothing in your head? But oh, that Shakespearean rag. It's so elegant, so intelligent. What shall I do now? What shall I do? I shall rush out.